welcome to another wonderful time with troublemakers, with good troublemakers. We named this program in honor of John Lewis, who invited us all to become good troublemakers. And as you've seen, if you've watched other segments of this program, that's what we're specializing in, people who make good trouble. And today is no exception. Today, my guest is Merri Ansara, who we'll call Merri, who is not Mary, but Merri. And Merri Ansara is a great Cuban advocate and has a long-standing relationship with Cuba. And as you probably know, involvement with Cuba makes you a maker of good trouble already. I'll just tell you quickly how I met Merri, because I thought it was serendipitous. You came to a rehearsal you were part of what was it,
the Hampshire Community Chorus.
The Hampshire Community Chorus. And some of us were holding a meeting in the same church building in Northampton, with an invitation to where our room was. That we were, the Cuban Solidarity Group was meeting, and all of a sudden this person came in, Merri Ansara, who came from Cambridge actually, and said, "This is where I need to be." So that was goodness gracious, that was quite a while ago. Any idea what year?
It was probably 2006, the year I came into what I call my velvet exile.
So since 2006, we're about to celebrate our 20th anniversary of working with Merri on Cuba. So let's start with your history with Cuba.
Oh my goodness.
Yes.
Well, to start on my history with Cuba, we have to start before that, which is I did come from a leftist family. In fact, I grew up thinking that from each according to his need, from each according to his work, to each according to his need. I thought that was the golden rule, because my mother, in her attempt to, I don't know, console herself or something from constant government persecution, also sent us to the Episcopalian Church. But anyway, so I grew up in a leftist bubble in segregated Virginia. And we were in that bubble not just because of my parents' convictions, but actually for protection of our family, because my father was among the first group of people to be hounded and witch hunted by the U.S. government under Truman. This was even before the McCarthy hearings. So I grew up in this bubble, but I didn't really understand it, and I really didn't understand the world around me. And so by the time I was in my teens and early 20s, I basically was in Chicago, sort of a very lost person. And my brother, of course, was very active. He was a leader in SDS and the anti-war movement, and has recently published those memoirs, which I recommend to people, called The Hard Work of Hope. But I couldn't figure it out. So I had retreated to Provincetown, where I waitressed and enjoyed life in the wonderful Provincetown, winter, summer, and fall. And then a waiter friend, read my astrological chart, and he said, "Well, there's travel in your future." So I thought, well, terrific. I'm going to go travel across the country. So I loaded up my VW with my possessions and my little dog Suki, and I drove up to Boston, where my parents and my brothers were living. And I needed to make some extra money, so I went to work at what I did, which was waitressing. But something had begun to stir while I was in Provincetown. It was a combination of the Black Panthers and the women's movement, which told me there might be something different than the kind of despair I felt at a place in the world. And so all I remember is, well, it was the time of the campaign on against MIT for their involvement in the Vietnam War. So I joined that, and I was running down the street amidst the tear gas, and somebody said, you know, they're going to Cuba to cut sugar cane. And I thought, oh, that's a really interesting idea, because I had this sub-notion that Cuba was kind of a utopia. So I signed up to go, and I imagine the only reason they took me is because I was my brother's sister, because really I did not fit the political bill at all. And so I went to Cuba, arriving there with the news of Fred Hampton's death, which we heard on the plane. And we had to sneak out of the U.S. through Mexico, where Mexicans in the employ of the U.S. took our photos. And then we arrived in Cuba. And it was immediately an extraordinary experience. And it was an extraordinary experience for two reasons. On the one hand, I had no idea who these other U.S. Americans were. They were talking about weathermen and trots, and I had no clue what they were talking about. And I thought now, they might...
This was the Venceremos Brigade.
This was the Venceremos Brigade. It was the very first Venceremos Brigade, and I landed in Cuba on December 5th, 1969. We were the first 216 people to go, which was a harebrained scheme cooked up by a few U.S. leftists and Fidel Castro. And they thought it would be a good idea. And 216 of us went, and 79 Cubans joined us, and the Cubans thought we would never cut any sugarcane whatsoever. I mean, it was just, for them, it was just laughable. But we were all in a camp out in the middle of the cane fields. And I was surrounded by these people who called themselves weathermen and trots, or SDS. I hadn't a clue. So I stuck to the Cubans in the group because they were more like my own, at that point, working person background. And I could relate to them. Well, of course, all the weathermen, trots, and SDS people just thought I was arrogant and stuck up. They didn't understand for a minute that I had no idea who they were or what they were talking about. And I was not about to say that I didn't. But anyway, so we did cut sugar cane. We did cut sugar cane, and the Cubans confessed that they were quite surprised at how well we did. And then we went and we had meetings with people who talked to us about what the Cuban dream and vision for their revolution was. This was 1969. This was 10 years on. And everything in the world seemed possible. Everything in the world seemed possible. And they wanted to share it with us. And Fidel came and cut sugar cane with us. Well, not with me. I was several fields over. And we had movies, and we had bands come. And then we traveled around the country in this line of vans. And all of a sudden, I realized, I mean, the trite way to say it is another world is possible. But I realized that the punishing world that I was from in the United States was not the only world that was possible, that it was possible to dream of more, not in an isolated bubble, but actually out large, with everybody saying, we can do more. We can build a better world. Well, I came home.
How inspiring. Let's just stop there for a
Yeah.
moment. I mean, we could do a whole segment on just your experiences with the Venceremos Brigade, but I think it's really important to look at that as a start. And you know, I mean, so many people, and I'm sure many of our listeners have heard of the Venceremos Brigade. And here you are, a real life person who was part of the very first one, and then came home, but got inspired by the aspirations of the Cuban people.
And listen to this. So years and years later, in the late 90s, the great late photographer Jerry Berndt and his partner had this idea of making a film about this very first Venceremos Brigade. So they asked me to find all 216 of these first Venceremos Brigade people and all 79 of the Cubans. And so I spent a number of months. Rosa Bornstein, who some people might know from Liberation News Service, she gave me a hand, tracking down these people. Because in those days, there were street guides at the libraries. I mean, there wasn't internet, but there were street guides, and one person led to another person, and there was this and that. And I actually found about 100 and, well, close to 200 of them.
Wow. Wait, now this is before the internet, before, yes. So good work.
They were doing all kinds of things. There was somebody who was a private detective. There was somebody who was the founder and leader of the San Francisco Gay Pride movement. There was a Hawaiian liberation leader in Hawaii. There was a member of Congress. There was a leading NPR reporter. There was somebody who taught philosophy at the Naval Academy. I mean, the range of people was amazing. And we're just talking about the U.S. side. And every single person, even those who had ended up not supporting the Cuban Revolution, said, this experience changed my life. And then I went to Cuba to try to find the Cubans. Well, in Cuba, there are not phone books to look in. What there is Radio Bemba, which is, you ask one person who leads to another person who leads to another, who needs another. And then we put a notice out on the radio that said, if you were on the first Venceremos Brigade, come to this place, which was the headquarters of the Cuban Institute of Friendships with the People, on thus and such a day, at thus and such a time. And between one thing and another, we found almost all of the people who had been on the brigade from the Cuban side. And Cuba had, it's very interesting, these were people who had shown some promise, either in their school or their work center, some in the communist youth, some not, who had been invited to join this experience. Every single one of them said, this experience changed my life. What they meant was that all of us coming together, I mean, don't forget, Cuba was under the first years, the embargo had been in place put in place in 1961-62. They were cut off from everybody. There was not the internet. There was not the Facebook. There was this group of U.S. Americans who turned up. And everywhere we traveled, I've met people years later who said, when you came to visit, it changed my world. So this was this extraordinary meeting between people who were isolated and on the defense and people who wanted to know all about them and what they wanted to do and what they were trying to build.
So let's dig deeply just for a moment on this. When people say, it's changed my life, would you be one of those people who said that?
Oh, yes.
So how did it change your life?
Well, I probably would not have survived. I probably would not be alive today because of the things that I was involved in. And even if I had survived, who knows? But all of a sudden, I found out that something else was possible. And I think that was true for everybody in the brigade.
Yeah.
Even the sophisticated SDSers, weather people, trots.
Now let's just for our audience, because most people probably know that those were the Trotsky people, the trots you're referring to, just to help anybody who's listening and watching and wondering, what trots, you know.
Trotskyites.
Yes.
And then the weathermen were people who had broken off from SDS. And I would say, it's fair to say, and Marge Percy has written brilliantly about this, by the way, that really in despair, there were people who basically came from families who went through the 60s and the Kennedy years thinking that the world was going to be theirs, and they found out that it really was not going to be. And the sense of despair, because these were primarily white people. They had the path that, say, the Black Panther Party had, where they could build up from their community and have a sense that they were actually accomplishing something, like starting the breakfast program in the schools that's now nationwide, starting the community health centers, defending truly their community. These were people who I think were in a lot of despair about what they were going to be able to accomplish. Well, many of them really have gone on to accomplish great things.
Yes.
It's true. But that was not their finest moment.
Yes. Yeah.
So, on the Cuban side, I think what people meant about it changed their life is that these were people who were pretty young, who had been offered an opportunity to talk about what they were trying to create in Cuba to people who, until that time, they could only assume thought that we're enemies of Cuba, and turned out not to be. So I think for a lot of them, it reinforced, and this, you know, needless to say, I'm in touch with a lot of them still. I think it reinforced for them that what they were doing by living the kind of life they had chosen to live, by giving up, well, they weren't giving up the possibility of the joys of capitalism, most of them. Most of them hadn't had any opportunities to go to college or to become artists or journalists or musicians before this. You know, that was only offered through the revolution. And they saw that, indeed, people would support them.
Yes.
That what they were doing was seen by people outside Cuba. And many of them have gone on to do extraordinary things, as I found out when I caught up with so many of them later. And many of them have also stayed in touch with each other. But there's a great variety of what they're doing. So one of them became the chief of police of Havana. Another became an ambassador to I don't know where. Another of them became the chief cook in a well-known restaurant. Another of them went into tourism. Another of them became a journalist. Another of them became a well-known musician. I mean, and I will tell you, so we had to go back on a cattle boat. There was no other way to go home. So we took a cattle boat 10 days from Havana to St. John, New Brunswick.
Oh.
Yeah, you couldn't fly back to Mexico, and the only other way was to go to Spain, and who had the money for that? So they cleaned out a cattle boat as best they could, not completely, and we went over rough seas to St. John, New Brunswick, where people came up and met us in cars. Well, on that boat, one of the people who was working with us, who later went on to become a tour guide, and the captain fell in love somewhere between the 10 days to St. John and the 10 days home. And they had gone on to create their family, and then they had gotten divorced, and then they heard the radio announcement, and they turned up and saw each other for the first time in, 20-something years. That was something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, so that was pivotal for you, and I love that notion that so many people share about, you know, how this particular experience changed your lives. So then you put it into practice. So we want to hear more about not just the wonderful aspirations but so, because, you know, one of the things we often talk about is, so what was the action?
Well, here's what happened. I came back and I did some work in the anti-war movement, meaning the anti-Vietnam War movement, but what really drew me, given my own personal background, was the Black Panther Party. They made sense to me, absolutely. So I went to work for a number of years with the Panther Defense Committee. But then I got a call to go back to Cuba to work at Radio Havana, Cuba, which is their international radio station, broadcast in 8 languages, including 2 indigenous, two indigenous languages of South America, plus Creole, French, English, Spanish, Arabic. So, and I said, but I don't speak Spanish. And they said, you'll learn. And I said, but I've never done radio. And they said, what was the catchword at the time? Siempre se puede más. You can always do more. And let me say that is basically what the Cuban Revolution was all about at that point. And when I try to describe it, the best description I can make is that Cuba at that time, and for decades and decades later, it was a country of opening doors. And all you had to do was choose to walk through that door. And then you could be whatever you dreamed of being. Compared to my experience and the experience of many in the United States, which is of slamming doors.
Yes.
You may have and particularly you look at this generation now, right? Yes, everybody can go and get educated, but they can't get a job, they can't get a house. So the experience of this country, and my experience of this country, was a country of constantly slamming doors. And only a few could get through those doors. So I went back to Cuba, and I worked in the radio. It turned out I had taken Latin in high school. And let me tell you, Latin and being really good with a dictionary was how I did it. I was an excellent translator, and I was also a broadcaster. And I was a broadcaster not just for Radio Havana, but for the Voice of Vietnam. And that was an extraordinary experience. Because here in this country, we were campaigning against the war, and we were doing it with a fair amount of despair. The Voice of Vietnam, I mean, I don't know how to describe it, but these were people who were sure that they were going to win. They were just sure that they were going to win because they knew that they had right and goodness on their side. And so these extraordinary young people had been sent from Vietnam to take a crash course in journalism at the University of Havana, and then were assigned to work at the Voice of Vietnam, which was run by this extraordinary older man, meaning he must have, we called him Fernando, he must have been in his 40s,
Yes.
whose wife was a gunner in Hanoi with a B-50, with some sort of a rifle trying to take down B-52s. And he always had such joy. Everybody in this group of Vietnamese had gone through such losses and were continuing to go through such losses. But they managed to maintain a joy and an optimism that was really inspiring. So they would come in, and I was responsible for reading the news, And we were reading these horrible things. Of all of these people killed, hundreds and thousands of people killed, villages destroyed. Hanoi shut down under bombs attacks, and there's a film that the great documentarian Santiago Alvarez made, which is about Hanoi, and it's scenes of people going into these manhole cover shelters from the bomb. I mean, people were hiding in caves. I mean, it was just, and they were filled with optimism. They thought they were going to win. And so, one of the things that I had the great privilege of doing is, the United States was covering up the fact that, I mean, everybody knows there was negotiations in Paris. What they don't know is that the Vietnamese were winning in the negotiations too. And they forced the United States to sign a peace accord in 1973. And then Kissinger and Nixon, of course, covered it up and pretended it hadn't happened. So we come into the studio one day, and there's everybody with big grins on their faces. I have a photo of it. It's just the grins are ear to ear. And we said, well, what's happened? They said, oh, just go into the studio and read it. So they played the national anthem, and we read it. Now, this was a very old-fashioned station. This was reel-to-reel tapes. We had an engineer. We had these funky microphones. And we start reading, and it's the peace accords. The U.S. military involvement in Vietnam is over. What an extraordinary moment. So then, after that, at the precise moment when the peace accords took place, everybody went rushing into the streets with pots and pans, and they rushed over to the South Vietnamese embassy. I'll never forget this. And the ambassador came out, and who was like an itty-bitty man, and everybody hoisted him up and went running through the streets with him. I mean, it was just extraordinary, just extraordinary. Yeah. Yeah. But I have to tell you what happened when I first started reporting at Radio Havana.
Okay.
I don't know how much time we have. We'll never get to the end of the story. So I arrived there in April. I think it was April 3rd, and I started work on April 4th. I might be wrong on the dates, in 1972. And the first thing given me to read as an announcer was the bombing of Hanoi and Haiphong. The terrible bombing of Hanoi and Haiphong. It was a blitz. So as soon as we finished the program, we went downtown where all of Havana was gathering in this giant demonstration. Giant demonstration. And there I was. I didn't speak Spanish. I didn't know anybody. I was like completely rattled and displaced. I had had a very hard time leaving the United States because, I'm very loyal to the United States. I'm loyal to where I come from, to the indigenous people and the African Americans and the immigrants who built our country and have hoped so much for what we could accomplish. And it was very hard to leave. And I'm in this demonstration with people I don't know, not understanding a thing. They strike up the chords of the Internationale, and a policeman grabs my arm. My God. In Chicago, I had a very close relationship with the police, and it wasn't a friendly one. And then an anti-war movement. And with the Panthers, let me tell you, the relationship with the police was not a good one. So this policeman grabs my arm, and I freak out. And I can't even say anything. And basically, somebody next to me who speaks English says, he just wants to be in solidarity with you. He knows you're a U.S. American. He wants solidarity with you. What an experience.
And I think this is part of what I wanted to hear from you, Merri, that, that we talk about another world being possible. And I don't think it's too trite. I think that is part of our aspiration, to be some kind of, in some ways, to contribute to that other world becoming possible. So the good experience with the Havana police officer, and then I love this story of the radio experience. And you know, I mean, one of the things that growing up here, I had to unlearn is that that our government controlled everything. And to hear of the solidarity between the Cubans and the Vietnamese. And you know, and I was smiling when you were talking about how the Vietnamese knew they would win. Well, you know, they had kept the Chinese out for centuries. They had defeated the French and you know, over decades. So the United States was just the last of a bunch of people who tried to oppress them, who tried to colonize them, and did not succeed.
But let me tell you something. Because the government witch hunted and persecuted my family all my parents' lives, all of their lives, it never let up. I never had a chance to identify with the U.S. government. So I really had to think of who I identified with in this country.
Uh-huh.
And there's plenty of people, too. There's plenty of people who have fought for this country. But I didn't have the experience, I think, of a lot of other people, of having to understand that our government is not on our side and reject it, and then feel, I mean, but I ended up feeling like I had no place to be, no place to belong. And I had to think very deliberately, because I chose to leave the country, who it was in the U.S. who I could identify and relate to. And I came to the conclusion that there's plenty of people. There's plenty of people. And even today, now, it's worth fighting for. But I have to tell you that in Cuba, I have to tell you, the scales quickly fell from my eyes. And what I found was not a perfect place at all, particularly back then. There wasn't the level of education. There wasn't the level of culture that there is now. There wasn't the level of political sophistication. My God, the machismo against women was just daunting. So it was really important to me, and it took me years and years coming back here and into activism here, and then going back to Cuba again, this time to work at the international edition of the newspaper. Again, had I ever worked at a newspaper? No. To sort of figure out what it was. And I think, you know, this is a lot of years since, and Cuba's gone through a lot, and it's not the country it was. But the bedrock is still the same, which is Cuba is still a country that made up its mind that it could do better, that it could be on the side of goodness, solidarity, humanity. And despite every problems that Cuba has, and they've taken them on. I mean, they took on the misogyny. They took on racism, though that still prevails. They took on all of these issues.
Well, I think let's just talk for a moment about education. You know, taking on, as you noted, before the revolution, what was the, what was the education level? What was the literacy in Cuba before?
Well, illiteracy was, you know, by a lot of standards of poor countries, it wasn't that high. It was only 23%. But it was also rare that anybody would go further than 4th grade or 6th grade.
Yes.
So, you know, wiping out illiteracy was a huge accomplishment, which was carried out by youngsters, some as young as 14. If you get a chance, see the movie Maestra. You can find it online.
Maestra.
Yeah,
Yes.
It's with people who are now my age who participated in that. And I, of course, have many friends who did. But that was the thing. I mean, even that, Cuba was an experience of changing people's lives through concrete actions of solidarity and engagement on the community level. And education, anybody can go to university to this day. Yes, you have to pass a test, right? You have to pass a test. And then, you know, because there's only so many people who can fit in any particular major, you have to select several majors and hope you get your first choice. But anybody can go on and get a PhD if they want. Mm. But let me say, the bedrock of the Cuban Revolution has not changed over all these years, which is that people have a right to everything they need to be able to lead their best lives. And that includes education and health care and housing and jobs and enough food to eat and transportation. And it is a huge disappointment to everybody in Cuba that the combination of a disastrous economy, especially following COVID, and these extraordinary strangling measures of the U.S. embargo, which is really a blockade, sanctions, and financial constraints through something called the list of state sponsors of terrorism, means that they can't deliver these things that are the bedrock of what everybody believes in.
Yes.
Right? So I'm not sure where I was going with that, but if I want to describe Cuba, I think both our countries are slogging through the mud. If you objectively examine what's happening, we are going backwards. We have nothing like what we had when you and I were kids, teenagers, 20s, 30s, 40s, and even into our 50s. Mm-hmm. I mean, yes, there were lots of people in this country who did not have that, but even I, who was a typist and a waitress, had things that are not accessible to anybody young today. And Cuba, at this moment, I would say that they're kind of stuck in the mud. Mm-hmm. You know, they're not able to go forward. But for all of the years, say from the last 25 years, they were still slogging forward through the mud. And they still are. They still, despite all of the hardships of the present, which we could talk about, there are at least half of the Central Committee of the Communist Party are women, and at least half of the parliament are women. But on top of that, 8 of the ministers of the most important ministries in the country are women. Many of the provinces have women as governors. 70% of all professionals are women. And also, they have, in the last few years, despite all of these hardships, passed a constitution that guarantees the right to gender identity, sexual orientation, that prohibits all weapons of mass destruction, including nuclear weapons. And in fact, there's a law in Cuba that prohibits purchase from any company anywhere in the world that manufactures parts that can be used for nuclear weapons. It guarantees as rights, or declares as rights, housing, jobs, all of these things that are rarely in a constitution. And then 2 years ago, they passed something called the Families Code, which says that families are of all kinds and that all members of the family have rights, including divorced members, including children, including grandparents. And it doesn't explicitly declare gay marriage because there was too much opposition from that from certain churches. But it says marriage is between two persons without definition.
So this is I appreciate all you're saying about Cuba, but I wanted to go back for a moment to how you acted to continue to have people involved and to learn more about Cuba, that the country that you know, that you love its aspirations too. And so how did you get into getting people like me to visit Cuba?
Yeah, but before I say that, I thought you were going to ask something else, which is, again, how have I put into practice here? I do not. My activism is not exclusive to Cuba by any means.
Oh, no, I'm not suggesting
I know you're
that,
not,
yes.
but the viewers might get that idea. I have been active all of my life since going to Cuba at the age of 26, been active in community organizing of all kinds, particularly housing, particularly women's rights, particularly peace issues, particularly anti-racism. And they are critical to me and my sense of being and my understanding of what I learned in Cuba, I need to put in practice here.
Yes.
And not only what I learned in Cuba, but what I learned from my parents and that wonderful integrated bubble I grew up in, well, at least until I was a teenager. In terms of Cuba, I have always, I have not been a solidarity activist, because solidarity activists often tend to describe Cuba as a perfect place where everything you want is just there. And it's better than anything that we could possibly do in the United States. And no, it is not. It is a very imperfect country. And if we are ever going to make the changes we need in this country, people have to understand that even when you're imperfect, you can do better.
Yes.
You and I have had this discussion,
Yes.
which goes, people do the best they can. And you leave it at that, and I say, and it's often not good enough, and we have to try harder. And that's the big lesson from Cuba, and that's the way I try to bring people to understand Cuba as an example of what we can do when we really try hard and fail and then try again. So I have worked in a number of solidarity organizations in Boston with, I've organized conferences, I've organized groups of business people around Cuba. I've organized in the late 70s, we had this wonderful organization called Dos Alas, Two Wings, that was Cuba and Puerto Rico, which have very similar aspirations and not too similar history after the start of the 20th century. And then I became a born-again intellectual, and I went to college. In 1980, when was it? Well, anyway, I was 40. I was working for these economists who could run circles around me, earned 1 million times more than I did, and were stupid. I mean, they were really stupid about how the world worked. So I decided to go to college. And first I went to UMass Boston, the College of Public and Community Service, and I did it while working full-time and a single parent of my child. And then I found that I was totally unemployable because I knew too much to be anybody's secretary anymore, and I stopped being good at following orders.
But were you ever good at following orders, Merri?
Yes, I was.
All right, enough said about that.
And nobody wanted to hire me because I only had a bachelor's degree and I was in my 40s, and nobody wanted to hire me to do anything. So then I thought I'd get a master's degree, so I came out to this area and got a master's degree, and then I was really unemployable because I had a master's degree, not much experience, though I had a wonderful 2 years at Cooperative Extension Service. What a wonderful place. Your tax dollars being spent the way they should be, which is community organizing. And then nobody would hire me because I had a master's degree, and they were younger, a lot younger than me, and they thought I'd take away their job. So then I decided that the only thing I could do was capitalize on what I knew how to do, which was introduce people to Cuba. So I decided to send as many people as I could to Cuba for two reasons. One is to see that they could do better, that there was another word possible, that it wasn't perfect, but you could work at it. And the other is to see that the U.S. government lies. And if they're lying about Cuba, what else could they be lying about? So first I did it, actually, illegally, to somebody in Toronto. And I had a really good time sending B actors from Hollywood on honeymoons, dentists, people on their bachelor trips. You know, like the bachelor party. I sent a few bachelor parties. I did. And, you know, anybody I could think of. And then I got approached by a group that wanted to send organic farmers to Cuba. And in those days, each person had to have a special license from the U.S. Treasury Department to break the embargo, right, which is the blockade. And so I applied for licenses for all 40 of these farmers, and they all got them. And they were so pleased with what they were doing, they put out a brochure. And I got a call one day from somebody named Elton Ellison, and his title was Enforcer. So I get a title from Elton Ellison, Enforcer, at the U.S. Treasury Department. He says, you know, I have this brochure here, and it says that these farmers are being organized by something called Common Ground. Are you making travel arrangements for them? And I said, just a minute, can I call you back? Hung up the phone and called Marizul Travel in New York and said, Bob, how'd you like to make some money without having to lift a finger? He said, sure. I said, well, here's my 40 farmers. And called Elton Ellison back and said, oh, I'm only advising them on their trip.
Good work.
So,
and so that's, I mean, that's some of your good trouble I'm thinking about.
Oh, that was trouble. And then I had to apply for a license, right? The jig was up. I had to apply for the license. It took 5 years for me to get one. I had to do it by organizing everybody to campaign OFAC, the Office of Foreign Assets Control, with faxes, letters, this and that and everything else. And finally got it on December 23rd, 1999. And you know when they ring the bell and say you've won, what is that called, the prize?
Yes, yes.
And people are jumping up and down? That was me.
I'm sure.
Jumping up and down. And so then I had already been making good trouble trying to get this little teeny tiny storefront away from scum landlord, working with the people in the building that was part of it. And they had promised me I could have the teeny tiny storefront if we won. So of course I did everything possible, and we actually won. The tenants got this building, I got the storefront. And we moved into it. I had a group of women, which I called Ladies in Jeans, who were all women in their 50s. And I had been collecting everything in my car and my porch and whatever. We moved in, and we held our party on, I don't know, I think it was January 10th, 2000. And the place, I mean, it was only 450 square feet, and the place was so full that everybody was out the door, and it included all kinds of people, several judges, state reps, ordinary people, because I was the first person in New England to get this license from the Treasury Department, and also the first person to be able to help Cuban Americans go home to Cuba, which I forgot to tell you was one of the big things I was doing. Helping Cubans get the necessary paperwork so they could go back and visit their families. And it was a terrific day, and for 20 years I got to throw parties, which consisted of sending people to Cuba.
Yes.
It was a lot of fun. It
Yes.
really was. And I didn't, again, it was university students, it was environmentalists, it was museums, it was psychologists, social workers, children's dance groups. I mean, everybody and anybody.
Yes.
And I worked directly with the Latin American Working Group in Washington that was working with the U.S. House of Representatives building the Cuba Working Committee, which was a bipartisan group. For every Republican, they had to have a Democrat, every Democrat a Republican, to try to change U.S. policy. And Mavis would call me up and say, we need 2 people in Iowa. And I'd go through my thousands of people mailing list and then get in touch with these people who were not activists necessarily, but who had come back from Cuba understanding the embargo was wrong.
Yes.
And I'd say, can you call your Congress? And they would.
Yes.
And that is what got us to 2014 and Obama's opening. It wasn't his good heart.
It wasn't.
It wasn't his good heart. It was pressure from Congress and pressure from thousands and thousands of people who had traveled to Cuba.
Yeah. Well, I think that's, as one of those thousands of people, I think it was so moving, and I'll share a quick story because I went to Cuba, and I came back and I was interviewed by another radio station, and I was just raving. I mean, because we haven't talked about the medical school, or how interventions or how happen. How if Merri is not doing well in school, they bring everybody together, the teachers, the doctors, everybody, to help support Merri to do better and to do well. And there were so many things, the cultural events we went to, listening to the music, and seeing because when I was there, it was during the special period. And
which was an economic near collapse that came about because the socialist world of Europe collapsed. And they had these bilateral relationships that allowed Cuba to build what they were building.
Yeah. So I came back just really so happy about seeing this experiment that was working, despite the embargo, despite all the U.S. pressures. And I remember one of the interviewers saying, "But Paki, that's a communist country." And I think I was so naive. I thought, well, yes, it is, but look what they're doing. If I were ill in Cuba, I could get medical care. And the other thing that was so impressive to me was once you go to medical school in Cuba, you go off to help other people. You help people in Africa and in other parts of underdeveloped or other oppressed countries. So, I was just so impressed. And put the communist label, put any label you want on it, but let's go a little deeper and look at what actually happens. What does Cuba export? Despite all the things it's got, doctors to help people get well. And what does my country export?
Weapons.
Yes, and I mean
mercenaries.
At one point, we had the mixed bags of USAID and other things that did some good things, and of course did some not so good things. But so I just think if we looked at that and said, what those are the aspirations. We talk about our aspirations as people living in the U.S. and that we know it's imperfect too. But our documents give us hope and give us the foundation upon which we can have our aspirations and see some of them actually fulfilled.
And we have.
And we have.
Yes.
Oh, yes. I mean, when you talked earlier about the heroes we have, there's this wonderful song about the heroes, and it's everybody from Eleanor Roosevelt to our own local Frances Perkins, that just amazing women and men who have done extraordinary things, and to know that those extraordinary things can become ordinary,
But I want to say something.
Sure.
I'm going to plug a way for people to go to Cuba, but first I want to say that all of this dream that Cuba represents, that it is possible to build a better world, that you're not always going to succeed, but if you keep trying, you can, is in terrible jeopardy. I mean, any other government in the situation that Cuba's in now would have collapsed by now. Mm-hmm. The Cuban government's not going to collapse. And it's not because it's an authoritarian or dictatorship, it's because it's on this foundation, this rock of community. But Cuba is in dire, dire trouble. I'm going to show on community television, wherever I can, this new documentary made by Belly of the Beast and Al Jazeera on the crisis in the medical system in Cuba. And you can see that because primarily the U.S. embargo, the sanctions, the financial constraints of the state list of so-called terrorists, the Cuban medical system now has people dying. You can still get your operation, but you can't necessarily get access to an anesthesia machine or to chemotherapy or to any number of drugs that you need. Infant mortality in Cuba was the lowest, one of the lowest in the world, and it's going up. And that is our responsibility.
Because the U.S. embargo doesn't allow all those things like medicines to complement the work that the doctors do. Yes.
They went out of their way to buy a machine that was going to be reliable from somebody who they had the right to buy it with. It didn't have any % of U.S. ownership. And now they've been told they can't get spare parts for it because the company's afraid to deal with them. And this is on, I mean, we have so much to take care of in this country. I mean, we have to fight back fascism.
Yes.
We have to take care of our neighbors. But we have to prevent more weapons going to Israel and elsewhere. But this is also our responsibility.
Yes.
Which is that an entire dream of building a better world with all the structures in place to do it, including changes that have been made since the special period we mentioned, is in jeopardy. And people are leaving because they can't get by. And when people are leaving, it means there's also shortages in the professions of teachers, of doctors. And to think that this promise that we can build a better world is in jeopardy. But it's not the only country in jeopardy, and I have to take this to say. So Venezuela is a pretty much of a mixed bag. Mm-hmm. But Venezuela is another country that's trying in its way, and we're about to launch war against Venezuela. And it won't just be war against Venezuela, it'll be war throughout the Caribbean. And they will attempt to drag Cuba into it. But just the thought that in this hemisphere, we can be responsible for the kind of war that's going on, for instance, in Ukraine. I mean, it's intolerable.
Yes.
And somehow we've got to make room and time in our good troubles to deal with this.
Yes. So we need to hear what
okay.
So, because that's the other thing I just want to mention. You know, you talk about the medical, the education, and all these other things. The culture.
Oh, yeah.
Is something we've given short shrift to, but you're going to now tell us some more.
Yes, I would say that Cuba is the country full of more bad artists than any place else on the earth, because anybody can become an artist, the way anybody can become a musician or a dancer. I mean, it's there, it's guaranteed, it's part of your rights. I retired from Common Ground in 2015. And yes, I've taken a couple of groups since. But a group of people, actually local people to this area, wrote to me last week and they said, we really really want to go to the jazz festival. Can you help us? So with Massachusetts Peace Action,
Just bring it down a bit, yes.
with Massachusetts Peace Action, we are organizing a trip to the International Jazz Festival in Havana, which we will be going January 24th to January 31st. The International Jazz Festival, it's in its 41st year. Musicians come from all over the world, including from the United States. And the entire city is filled with music. Every bar, every restaurant, every theater has performances, and then there are jam sessions all over. And you can come. You can join us. And I hope you will.
And so how does one sign up?
What you do is you write to me, Merri, M-E-R-R-I, at masspeaceaction.org.
MERRI at masspeaceaction.org.
Yep.
And you could be part of this wonderful cultural experience in Havana, Cuba.
And it'll again be just ordinary people, anybody who wants to go.
Yes.
You're not going to have to know what a trot is. You're not going to have to know what a weatherman is. You can just come and enjoy. You don't even have to know Cuba. You don't even have to know Spanish. You can just come and be part of a wonderful community event of music.
Yes. So that's one of the things that you're working on. I just wanted to ask you about...
and we will also be taking suitcases of medical supplies, I can tell you.
That's the good trouble, too. Now, you're also working with our legislators. I know right now it's pretty hopeless because, among other things, Marco Rubio, who is a disgruntled...
Second generation. He wasn't even born in Cuba, for heaven's sakes.
He wasn't?
No. His parents left in 1956. That's 3 years before the revolution. He just saw his path, where he could get elected, where he could make bad trouble.
Yes.
And he's taken it.
Yes.
Built a career on it.
So we've got him as an obstacle, and we've got the whole Republican apparatchik. So we have to work against those so that we could perhaps get some good legislation passed, but that's down the road.
Well, in this congressional district, you are very fortunate to have my friend, and he is my friend. I've known him since 1997, Jim McGovern, who is good on many fronts. I mean, he's taking on the
Yes.
food issues. He is somebody who has fought against the U.S. policy and for normalization with Cuba all of his career before he was even elected. When he worked for Joe Moakley, which is when he also interested Moakley in opposing the Contras and that whole scandal. And he has in the past organized letters to the White House signed by congressional representatives, and that's really the one path left to us. I don't know whether he can or would do that or not, but you can let Jim know, if you're here in this district, that you support him and you know that he will do what he can. You also can let your state representatives and senator know. A number of them have traveled to Cuba, so they know. And by the way, do we have time for me to talk about the connections between Massachusetts and Cuba, which are many? I don't think we do. But Massachusetts
How
has
quickly can you do? Go ahead.
Massachusetts has a long historical connection with Cuba, going back to the first sugar. Hatfield produced wrappers for Cuban cigars. The first ice company in the United States, which was in Massachusetts, sent ice to Cuba.
And that was a different kind of ice than we have today.
Oh, God,
I mean,
yes.
This is the frozen water ice.
That was frozen
water.
water.
It was the good ice.
As opposed to the ice we wish we could crush.
Well, we're working on crush diets.
Teachers came to study here. There were people who went back and forth all the time. And recently as last year, a number of state representatives went. And
I think you helped organize that, did you not?
Well, I did.
Yes.
I did.
So still doing that good trouble.
Yes, so it's not, what you can do is stay tuned. And in fact, if you're simply interested in being on the list to know what you can do, say you can't go to the jazz festival. Not everybody can go, I'm sorry to say. I'll take you if you can, but I know that's not possible for everybody. But if you want to be able to follow up with what's happening in Cuba, oh, and did I say we're having a weekly film series? Anyway, you can write to me at the same email, and I will make sure you're on the list to keep track. But also, at East Hampton Library, the first Monday of the month, we are showing Cuban films and having discussions, including with people who are very knowledgeable on the subject, about Cuba. And we just, last night, showed a film on Asada Shakur, a Cuban film. And then Monday, December 1st, we're showing this darling of a film called Havana Station, which is about two boys from, in the Cuba of the early 90s, where there was beginning to be different social strata, two boys who come together across that. And so it's a discussion of community, solidarity, rising inequalities, and how to overcome them. That's at the East Hampton Library Annex, Monday, December 1st at 5:45.
Yes. So, Merri, I'm so happy that you were willing to come on all the way up to Greenfield and to join me for this, because I think it's so important. You know, we've had a number of people who also get into good trouble, whether it's with OFAC or with various parts of our government, that we need to keep standing together. And this, your work with Cuba, your work just even in this hour, just sharing what your history with Cuba is, has been so important. So thank you so much. Is there a last word you want to say?
No, I want you to have yes, I do want the last word. We must resist fascism. We must. We must protect our neighbors. We must not allow our courts to be taken over, or our streets, or our neighborhoods. And no matter what, we cannot give up.
Yes, we can. Si se
Yes, we
puede.
will.
Yes. Thank you, Merri Ansara, for being part of this conversation and for joining me here today. And thank you, watchers, viewers of this program, for staying with us and for hopefully learning something and maybe even getting a trip to Cuba out of this. Thanks.
Oh, and by the way, even if you can't go with the jazz, to the jazz festival, if you just want to go to Cuba, write me, and I'll tell you how to go. I've even produced a little video on it. But you can go to Cuba. You don't need me, you don't need a group, you can just go. And by doing that, you will be helping the Cuban people, and you will be making good trouble against our government, though you will go legally. I can promise you, I will tell you how to go legally.
Thanks, Merri.